Hey church, today we are in the 8th chapter of John, and for the next 2 days we're going to split it into half. Today we're going to go through John chapter 8 verses 1 through 30. So go ahead and press pause and read John chapter 8, 1 through 30. All right. Verse 1, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again into the temple, and all the people were coming to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. Remember, the temple is in Jerusalem, and the reason that Jesus and his disciples are in Jerusalem is they're celebrating the Feast of the Tabernacle. The Feast of the Tabernacle was a week-long feast, and it was to commemorate the 40 years that the Israelites wandered in the wilderness after leaving Egypt before entering into the Promised Land. And so that's going to come up later on in this chapter as an important part. But for now, we have to understand what Jerusalem represented. Jerusalem was really the heart of the Jewish religion because the temple was there. And so many things are centered on Jerusalem and centered on the temple in the Bible. But Jerusalem was also the seat of power for a lot of the people that represented the opposition to Jesus. So the Pharisees and the religious elites and the lawyers, most of them and most of their power was centered in Jerusalem. Jesus spent the majority of his ministry and the majority of his life in the north of Israel, in the area of Galilee, and every once in a while he would come down to Jerusalem, but every time he did, there were fireworks. And again, we're going to see these fireworks happen. In verse 3, the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, and having set her in the center of the court, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What then do you say we shall do?" Okay, so again, the Pharisees are coming, trying to conceive these traps to get Jesus, right? You can kind of imagine what happened here. There's a really weird scenario. They're in the temple. Thousands of people would have been around. Jesus is there teaching, and the Pharisees spring this trap on him. They find this woman who they had caught in adultery, right? And look, it's not easy to catch somebody in adultery in the middle of the day, whatever the situation is. So this was a setup, okay? They were setting this woman up, and they clearly she was guilty of this sin, but they caught her and they brought her for the purposes of trying to trap Jesus. Now, this was a crime in the Mosaic law, and it was a crime worthy of the death penalty. And there's some really good reasons why adultery would be treated as so serious. In a culture like ours, where adultery is so prevalent and so prominent, it's hard for us to even imagine such a severe penalty. But in a culture that upholds the family and the centrality and the significance of the family, you know, if we paid a lot more respect and put a lot more importance on the family, I think that it might make a lot more sense to us why you would have something like capital punishment for adultery. And that's the situation that was here. But rather than bring this woman to the authorities, they brought her to Jesus because they're not actually trying to catch this woman. What they're trying to do is they're trying to trap Jesus. And the reason this is a trap is because while the Mosaic law teaches that, the law of the Romans, which was the powers that were occupying Israel at that time, disallowed that law, and they said you can't kill people, and you can't adjudicate your own capital punishments. And so there's a question of who are you going to obey? Are you going to say yes, we should stone her? Or are you going to say no, we should stone her? And either way, whatever your answer is, we're going to try to trap you and get you. Well, Jesus, like he always does, he's just not playing their game. It says in verse 6, they were saying this, testing him so they might have grounds for accusing him. But Jesus stooped down, with his finger wrote on the ground. But when they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw the stone at her." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they began to go out one by one, beginning with the older ones, and he was left alone, and the woman where she was in the center of the court. Okay, so we get this kind of mysterious, we're not actually sure what happens. There's a lot of speculation. What is Jesus doing here? What's he writing in the sand? Some people have speculated that maybe he's writing some of the sins of the men who were there, and that's why when they leave, they go out from oldest to youngest. We don't know. The answer is, we don't actually know what the reason is that Jesus is stooping down writing in the sand. But it's clear from the wisdom with which he responds to him, and he just says this one line, "You who is without sin, cast the first stone." And then they just begin to leave. Because they know that they are in the midst of sin right in that moment, right? They're trying to catch this woman. And look, Israel worked the same way. They had a justice system. They had a way of doing things where if you were arrested, you would go to the authorities, and we have jails, right? So if you catch somebody breaking into your house, you're not allowed to lock them in the basement of your house for 3 years until they've paid the penalty for breaking into your house, right? No, you have to call the cops, and we send them. If they're convicted, they go to jail. Well, the same situation here. You have to take her to the judges, and you can't just stone the woman right there on your own authority. And so these men were trying to trick her. We're trying to trick Jesus, and we're trying to condemn her. And yet Jesus just calls them out and calls in the sinfulness of their own identities, themselves, and they begin to leave one by one. Straightening up in verse 10, straightening up, Jesus said to her, "Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "I do not condemn you either. Go forth from now on and sin no more." So Jesus is partly what he's saying is this woman might be guilty of death. Now, if they tried to catch her, it's called entrapment. If they tried to entrap her, she wouldn't be guilty of death, but that would be an illegal way of catching her. But if she's guilty of adultery, which it seems like she was, she would have been guilty of death. But Jesus doesn't have the authority in that judicial system to condemn her or to kill her. And he does release her. And on his releasing this picture of Jesus' grace and his mercy that he has on us as sinners, he does also confront this idea of go and sin no more. It's really a beautiful picture of the way that Jesus has dealt with many of us. In our sin, guilty, worthy of the punishment of death, God has given us mercy and grace. And he's called us to walk holy and walk faithful with him. Well, it transitions into verse 12. And verse 12 through 30 represents a conversation. In fact, it's going to continue to go on after verse 30, but it's a conversation that Jesus is having with those who are standing by. And he's talking about who he is, where his authority comes from. What is Jesus' actual identity? Let's just read verse 12. Then Jesus again spoke to them, saying, "I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in the darkness, but will have the light of life." This idea of Jesus being the light of the world, we see it in John chapter 1, we see it in John chapter 3, and now we see it here in John chapter 8. It's an analogy that John has relied on to describe and explain, or that Jesus has relied on to describe this idea of contrasting light and darkness, and that Jesus represents the light of the world. But there's two other things that are going on here that are really important as Jesus is testifying about himself and his own authority. One is, like we talked about earlier, is that this was during the Feast of Tabernacle. And the Feast of Tabernacle, one of the things they were commemorating was in the wilderness when the people of God were led by a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day, an illuminated cloud by day. It was literally light that led them through the wilderness to where God was going to provide for them in different encampments where God was going to take care of them. What it represents is this idea is we move through wilderness towards the promised land, that God will lead us. And for the Jew, as they're celebrating that was a powerful time of God's supernatural deliverance for them and walking with them. Okay, well, when we think about that, what they would actually do during the Feast of Tabernacle in the temple is they would light these candelabras. They would have hundreds and hundreds of them. And to the point where the entire thing would be lit up at night to represent this time when God miraculously delivered them. And so Jesus standing in that part of the temple were just surrounded by all these lamps, all these candelabras where all these candles would have been burning. And he's saying this thing that these candles represent, I represent in a deeper way, right? Because even as we look to the Old Testament, we think about the Jews traveling through the wilderness and following the light, right? Moving towards the promised land. That's a prophecy about the human condition and what Jesus was going to do. As we walk through the wilderness of this life and sin and the brokenness that we find, as we follow the light and move towards the promised land of eternal life, that was going to be it. Jesus also says, when he says, "I am the light of the world," the "I am" there is the same "I am" that was used in the burning bush with Moses. Who should I say sent me? I am that I am sent you, right? It's a declaration of him being God himself. And it also harkens to a prophecy about the Messiah from Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2. It says, "The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in a dark land, the light will shine on them." So this would have been a verse that was really familiar of a messianic prophecy from the Old Testament, from the book of Isaiah, that when he said this, many people would have recognized that Jesus was making a claim to the messiahship. He was making a claim to be God himself. The Pharisees rejected him. They said, you are testifying about yourself. Your testimony is not true. They're saying you need more witnesses than just yourself. But Jesus answered and said to them, even if I testify about myself, my testimony is true. For I know where I came from and where I am going, but you do not know where I come from or where I'm going. One of the things he's saying is I'm God, okay? I can testify about the truth of who I am. And where I come from is into eternity. Where I'm going is into everlasting. That Jesus is from the very beginning till the very end. He's the Alpha and the Omega. And so he's saying that you don't even understand where I'm coming from or where I'm going. Let's skip down to verse 18. He says, I am who testifies about myself, and the Father who sent me testifies about me. He's recognizing that he's going to say in verse 28, it says, so Jesus said, when you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and I do nothing on my own initiative, but I speak these things as the Father taught me. His authority is coming from God the Father himself. Verse 29, he said, he who sent me is with me, and he has not left me alone, for I always do the things that are pleasing to him. As he spoke these things, many came to believe in him. As he testified about who he is, where he comes from, and as people put their faith and trust in him, people were converted in that moment. They believed in Jesus. They received the forgiveness of their sins, and they entered into that new birth that he talked about, what we looked at in John chapter 3. Well, he's going to go on in verses for the rest of the chapter, and he's going to talk to these new believers. He's going to teach them about what it means to follow him. It's a powerful part of Scripture. We're blessed to be able to read it and go through it with you guys. God bless you guys, and we'll see you tomorrow.